My namaskarams to all. When somebody is being introduced, of course, when you introduce a person, you are very generous and even exaggerated. But that raises the bar for the speaker. He has to perform to the extent to which he has been introduced. So sometimes not being introduced is more advantageous. But this is a word which runs on brands. In Srimad Bhagavatam, on the characteristics of Kali Yuga, there is one verse. It says that in Kali Yuga, good speakers will be mistaken for scholars. So you must understand, if somebody speaks well, you don't equate that speech for scholarship, because we have suffered this kind of oratory in politics, in religion, everywhere. But the important point is that we are in an ecosystem of darkness. Darkness not in the moral or religious or spiritual sense, it's pure material knowledge. But fortunately, the internet opens us to unbelievable sources of knowledge, which are not tapped at all. In fact, my acquisition of knowledge in the last several years has been several times more than the knowledge that I accumulated the earlier 30 years of my life, though I was a very voracious reader. So I just begin with how this unbelievable medium can bring you knowledge, which the entire system of government, education, public discourse, media denies you. So you all go after the meeting is over and search for a site, Power Kills. The name of the site is Power Kills. This is a site which was built by Professor R.J. Raman of Hawaii University over 30-year research, maybe even more. And he built this very huge website about how violence has dominated the world for the last 2,500 years, and how human beings have maimed, killed, raped, and devastated human beings, and he called it democide. And it is 2,500 years of human savagery against human beings. But if you find, he has given detailed list of where, in which year, sometimes in which month, sometimes in which date, these mass killings have taken place, and which geographies of the world. The total killings he estimates in these 2,500 years is 1.2 billion, 120 crores at the maximum, and at the minimum 68 crores, 618 million. And if you go through the list of the schedules and the citations he has given about the killings that have taken place all over the world, the one geography in which there has been no killings till the 13th century is Bharatvarsha. When human beings were slaughtering human beings all over the world, is an oasis of peace. Harmony. How? And this was not just a geography. It was a geography which had its own characteristics, which had its own identity, which had its own heritage, history. Somebody may even dismiss it as mythology. In fact, modern thinking, modern history, modern politics, modern demographic approaches are very new. In fact, the very concept of what is called the nation has been a product of 19th and 20th centuries in the West. Only in 1780, for the first time, the idea of nation state came. And the greatest research in this respect has been done by Erich Hobsbawm. Of course, a Marxist writer, of course. He wrote it from the Western experience, how the nation states evolved only because of the state and not the states did not evolve because of the nation. This is the Marxian theory. But the evidence that he has mastered to show that there is no concept of nation in the West. It was all tribals trying to dominate one another and defining themselves as nation. For example, when France was born, less than 2% of the people knew the French language. When Italy was discovered, less than 3% of the people knew the Italian language. It is not that the language produced the nation, it is the state. It is the state that produced the language and propagated the language and made the identity of the state the language. So, when all this was happening, when we were dominated, when we were conquered, the British said you are not even a nation. We made you into a nation. This was happening not now. This was happening when there was no concept of nation in the West. So if you look at the kind of ignorance that prevails about our assessment of ourselves, knowledge of ourselves, I really do not know where to begin. In fact, when I was invited to a lecture in the IIT Bombay, there is something which was a revealing kind of occasion for me, because this has something to do with economics, something to do with sociology, something to do with politics, something to do with the very idea of what we are. So, ahead of me, one great industrialist, Adi Godrej, he spoke and he said that in India we never had a sense of prosperity. We never knew what prosperity was. And we were a nation which worshipped poverty. And we believed poverty was a virtue. And only after globalization came and all these new cars and new brands of scooters and all kinds of facilities came, we came to know what prosperity and what joy meant in life. Until globalization, this country was great in spirituality, in architecture, in music, in literature. But its performance was worse, bad, in economics. This was his presentation. The entire IIT audience stood and clapped him, and I was to speak next. So you can understand what was the kind of burden that was imposed on me. But I was surprised at the kind of ignorance, illiteracy that prevails in such high-end institutions, which act as the interpreter between West and India, representing India to the West and introducing us to the West. And if this audience is prepared in this kind of ignorance, I could understand somebody speaking like this in 1950, 1960, 1960, 70, even in 1980. But after 1983, if somebody spoke that India was not a prosperous nation in the past, then the man had something very badly and sadly lacking in the collection of his knowledge. I will tell you how all this emerged. Our idea about ourselves did not emerge out of our thinking. It emerged out of the thinking of the people who never knew India, who never dealt with any Indians, who never came to India. It is they who shaped India. For example, take Karl Marx, who is supposed to be one of the most powerful influences on the Indian intelligentsia, academic, media, public discourse, politics. In 1853, he wrote a couple of articles in the New York Herald Tribune. That is called the International Herald Tribune. In which he wrote that he called it Hindustan. The idea that we were one nation was there at that time. It was questioned only much later. Marx called India one nation. And he said it is a Hindu nation. And he said it's a very peculiar country. And there is some kind of a national organization, its infrastructure, people's mobility from one place to another is taken care of, its rivers are properly maintained, waterways are maintained, roadways are maintained, people move from one end of the country to the other, and there is a sense of one civilization. This is one part. He said the other part is, astonishingly, its economics is organized on the basis of villages. Every village is economically independent and virtually did not need anything from the next village. So he said He even later defined it as primitive socialism because there was very little exploitation, there was some kind of equality, economic equality prevailing at that time. But he said the problem with these people is that they are worshipping monkeys, they are worshipping cows, they are semi-barbarians. You see, there are three kinds of assessment. That we were one nation, that we had a sense of nation, we had mobility amongst us, and that we had an economic organization which was not that exploitative as he saw in the West. But his problem was our worship of cows and monkeys, for which he called us semi-barbarians. He never came to India. He never read any worthwhile Indian literature. And he perhaps never met any Indian in his life. And he became one of the most powerful influences on the Indian psyche, Indian intelligentsia, Indian academic, Indian media. And even today the greatest distortion about India in the mind of Indians has been cast by Marxian thinking. So you can understand how he externalized, how we had intellectually, psychologically, philosophically outsourced our assessment about ourselves to people who had nothing to do with it. Then came Max Weber. Max Weber is probably one sociologist who connected economics to sociology, culture, value systems. He made a thorough study of the Protestant and Catholic civilizations. A Catholic, I would say, not a religious difference. He felt it was an attitudinal difference between two attitudes to the same religion. He said all the Protestant nations are coming up and all the Catholic nations are stagnating or going down. It is because the Protestant nations promoted individualism, liberty, enterprise, and therefore entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is the pivot of modern capitalism. And so Protestant ethics is what is driving modern capitalism, whether it is America, Canada, New Zealand, England, Australia. All these nations were progressing fast, and all the Catholic nations, whether it is Italy or Spain or parts of France or Germany, were all lagging behind. He was absolutely right because 30 years he made the study as to how theology or theological interpretation impacts on economic development. This was sometime in 1895 or 97. But sometime in 1919 he ventured to write on Hinduism and Buddhism. He wrote a book, Religion of India, that's about Hinduism, and another book, Religion of China, that's about Buddhism. He certified that these two nations can never come up because they believed in karma and rebirth, and they had become fatalistic. They had outsourced the concern about their life to an external force, that we are controlled by something external, our karma, our previous birth, our next birth. And he said these two nations can never come up in economics. This was his judgment. You know, there are researchers in social sciences. Any social science student will be able to certify what I am saying, that these two thinkers were the greatest influence on India. It is not that they said that Protestant or Catholic thinking is contradictory, and Catholics must adopt Protestant thinking is something which could be understood because these are societies which he had studied. But he ventured to write about societies, philosophies, ways of life, cultures, civilizations, about which he had no qualification, no knowledge, no familiarity. But don't think this remained only at the scholarly level. This was adopted in the global thinking after 1940, after the Second World War. I am going to read out to you a stunning document by the United Nations which adopted Marx and Weberian thinking. and advise the developing nations as to what they should do, underdeveloped nations, as to what they should do if they wanted to develop. This advisory was issued by the United Nations Introduction, Development and Anthropology of Modernity.